Hello, and thank you for listening to the Keto Answers podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Gustin, and joining me this week is Dr. David Perlmutter. You're going to know of Dr. Perlmutter from his crazy successful book called Grain Brain, which is one of the first pieces of work that was out there. I think it launched 5 years ago that brought grains, gluten, wheat, sugar, and the impact on brain health to the forefront of American pop culture. And since then has just been doing a lot of tremendous work. And so in this episode, we talk about, everything that he's learned since he first launched the book 5 years ago. And I think you'll probably be shocked about how much science has changed from even 5-6 years ago when he wrote this book to today. So he's looking about incorporating a lot of this work into new things that he has coming out. But again, I'm shocked always that I have a Google alert set to remind me of when new keto research comes out. And it seems to be pretty much every single day that new research comes out. So he's well aware of this. He's no stranger to changing his mind, updating his view, and you're going to get a lot of his updated takes on what he's learned in the last 5 years since he first published Grain Brain. So without further ado, enjoy the conversation with Dr. David Perlmutter. Before we get to the episode, I wanted to chat about our sponsor, Perfect Keto. Perfect Keto is all about making a ketogenic diet healthy and accessible. Whether you're reading all of our online guides or articles or enjoying Perfect Keto's exogenous ketones or any other keto-friendly products, everything you need to make keto work for you is at perfectketo.com. I know what you're thinking. Hey, aren't you the founder of Perfect Keto? Yep, that's right. And all of my insanely high standards have been put into making each and every product. My background as a functional medicine clinician helps me craft the cleanest and healthiest possible products and the best information about a ketogenic diet. Head on over to perfectketo.com to learn anything you need to know about the ketogenic diet. And if you've never tried any of our products before, feel free to use the code KETOPODCAST for 20% off your first order. With that being said, let's get into the show. Doc, thanks for jumping on the show today.
Delighted to be here.
So there's a lot of things that you've done for this industry as far as pushing awareness and having Grain Brain kind of come on the map a long time ago. What was that, 5 years ago now? And I just want to kind of share your story of how you got to that point and where things have been since then. I mean, a book is one of these things that's tough to get out. I'm working on one now, and it's excruciating. I know you've done two and working on more. And I'm like, one of the things that I'm fearful of most is that once you hit that publish date, that lives out there forever, and you can't really take that back. And things change so quick, especially in the keto space right now with how much research is coming out. So yeah, I mean, I think we have a lot to dig into here.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it, and I have to say you're correct. Grain Brain was published 5 years ago, and a lot has happened since then. And there is a bit of frustration once you publish a book and it's memorialized, because you feel that, gosh, you wish you could have included various things, and that's often very frustrating. But, you always have the opportunity to revise the book, but B, that's what, your internet site is all about. You can keep people up, like your podcast you're doing right now, keep people up to date with the latest research. And the important point here that your listeners need to embrace, and that is that things will change with time, and not to be derogatory towards an author, a physician, in my case, researcher, because the messaging has changed, but embrace that because it means that we're doing the very best we can to stay ahead of the curve here and on top of the science. So, if you would have looked at the things I had written 20 years ago, they were far different than what our messaging is today, and that's actually a very good thing.
Right, and I think that it's a good sign when you have people who are willing to change their mind about things. I've caught some flack recently because I've changed my stance on something regarding protein intake on a ketogenic diet. And when I first made this claim of that you should really limit it 4 years ago, we didn't have a lot of the research that we have now. Now there's a lot of research that shows that you get pretty much just as much glucose out of fat that turn from gluconeogenesis in a ketogenic diet, so that protein is just in. We've had people on really high proteins of diets, and gluconeogenesis from protein just isn't holding up the way we thought it was. So I've updated my thinking, but some people I don't think like that. But I mean, I'm totally transparent about this is what I thought was correct before, and this is what I think is correct now. And I think that you don't always have to do a 180, but updating your thinking and changing your approach over time is usually a good sign, like you said.
You bet. And offering up the justification for that. In other words, where is the science that allowed you to make this change, and why you're making the change? And I like the fact that we're in this field, we're dynamic in that regard. And again, I think that that's something that most of our followers are happy with, and the fact that we learn. Things have changed since I wrote Grain Brain 5 years ago. Actually, published it 5 years ago, so wrote it maybe 6 years ago. That doesn't sound like a big difference, but it is these days. 1 year makes a big difference in terms of how quickly science is evolving. But we've learned quite a bit since then. We've learned, and much of it has been validating, that our contentions in Grain Brain, that eating a diet higher in sugar, higher in carbs, gluten-laden diet is not good for the body and is certainly not good for the brain. And really across the board, those contentions have been confirmed by follow-up studies and much more extensive studies, more than we certainly had at the time we wrote this book. So, there's been this incredible surge of interest in really lower carbohydrate, lower sugar diets, to the extent that people have been getting into ketosis, therefore pushing the research on, well, gee, what is it that the ketogenic diet is actually doing to people? And I think by and large, we're learning some very, very exciting things about what these ketones are doing in terms of gene expression, in terms of reducing inflammation, in terms of stimulating certain cell receptors called G protein receptors that have very good effects in the body and in the brain. So we're really learning quite a bit. And I think part of that has been because of the general public interest and acceptance of this so-called ketogenic diet. And I think that's kind of pushed, the various researchers around the country to really, continue to do more.
Right. And I think that, so I'd love to jump into this stuff in greater detail, but I kind of want to dig into how you came to these conclusions in the first place. You were one of the first people chatting about this stuff 6 years ago or so. What was your clinical background before that? Was there a moment in time where you realized, like, oh man, this is not what I was taught, and things are very different? Or
absolutely.
How did you come
you got
to that?
it. I mean, you pegged it. And I came to a mainstream general practice of neurology in 1987, and a long time ago, that's for sure. And for the next 10 years, I stayed with this practice, and as time went on, I realized it was extremely frustrating for me to be in a situation of basically diagnose and adios, meaning we made great diagnoses, but we couldn't really help people. We could treat some symptoms of the various neurological conditions that we dealt with, but in terms of really treating the disease, we had very little to offer people. So, I was not satisfied with that. I needed more tools in the toolbox, and so basically went to the literature and started reading and began attending various functional medicine, integrative medicine conferences where neurology was very, very underrepresented, as it still is for that matter. And really, as it relates to a ketogenic diet, for example, this research has been there since the late 1960s. This isn't new. People have been talking about how powerfully effective ketogenic diet is to improve the health of the brain, to reduce degeneration, to treat seizures, to amplify how nerves work, etc. This research is not new. And to discover that, the ability of getting people into ketosis by caloric restriction or by dietary change, by favoring dietary fat and reducing carbohydrates, really sounded very appealing to me. And I decided, just based on what I was reading, to go ahead and begin lecturing about it and begin utilizing these protocols in treating patients, actually intervening with patients and saying, look, I've read this information. Here's the laboratory research. Here's the animal research. Makes sense. Let's give it a shot. And people started to improve dramatically with a variety of issues. And, since then, over the years, we've seen some really beautiful validation of these interventions with the treatment of Parkinson's, for example, and even Alzheimer's and autism and seizures and chronic headaches and generalized fatigue, for example, even type 1 and type 2 diabetes, for that matter. And I'm sure you're aware of literature from Dr. Thomas Seyfried dealing with using a ketogenic diet as an adjunct in the treatment of cancer.
Mm-hmm.
So we were early out. I know that. And did I push it a little bit? Yeah, I did. Because I felt I had nothing to lose, and I had strong conviction in these ideas. And beyond that, the notion that gluten represented a threat to health and to the brain specifically. There wasn't a huge body of literature out there when Grain Brain was written, but there was enough for me to hang my hat on. And of course, we know now over the past 5 years, the literature supporting this notion that you can have sensitivity to gluten even though you don't have defined celiac disease has become a thing, a very real thing, as described in the Journal of the American Medical Association, research from Harvard published back in 2017, a study called Celiac Disease and Non-Celiac Gluten Sensitivity by Dr. Alessio Fasano. So, these things have been confirmatory. They have been validating for us and our contentions, and it basically means moving forward, the work continues.
Right. And so you had frustration. You went to go kind of find another path forward, and it was a ketogenic diet that brought this forward for you?
That's one part of it. That was one element, but my goodness, we were really the first, I think, to begin the use of antiviral medications for Alzheimer's with the literature that was demonstrating a strong relationship of Alzheimer's risk in individuals who had high levels of antibodies against herpes simplex virus type 1. That said, since that time, we've seen some wonderful validation of that idea. From Harvard researchers as well. We were, I think, early on in recognizing, for example, that changes in the gut bacteria can cause issues, metabolic issues that relate to brain health. And we actually, I think, pushed the envelope again, and were pioneers in using fecal transplant, the transplantation of fecal material from a healthy individual into a person who was ill to treat neurological conditions and generalized fatigue and even autism. Now we've seen many follow-up studies that have been done at research institutions to confirm that was a reasonable idea, and again are demonstrating positive results. So again, neurology is a field that really doesn't have a lot going on in terms of really rock solid things that you can do for people that are meaningful, aside from, give them pain medicine for the headache. Why not treat the underlying cause of the headache? Is it a food sensitivity? Is it low blood sugar? Is it gluten sensitivity? Is it restorative sleep? That's the kind of, I think, evaluation that patients really need to get to the root of the problem, rather than simply feeling you've done a good day's work by managing their symptoms exclusively.
Right. And so you said even that some of this research has been out since the 60s. Why do you think, this happens all across healthcare, but specifically in your field, that we're so slow to adoption, or I guess at least trying some of these things when everything else isn't working? Like what is the gap there that we're not being mindful of?
Well, I think it's an old habits die hard issue. It's also people tend to be down on what they're not up on. And I think the latter, is much more important, because you don't really still to this day see a lot of information in the mainstream medical journals that talks about things like gluten sensitivity very often, or using a ketogenic diet, although we're starting to see it more and more. And, I'm, of course, very sensitive to that. So when these studies are published, they jump right out of me, because I have Google programmed. If the word ketogenic is in a medical article, I get it, as soon as it hits the wire. But I think more and more people are becoming aware of it. But, you have to understand your typical medical practice is really not set up to be able to incorporate something like, for example, a ketogenic diet or even a gluten-free diet in a patient. They don't have on staff a nutritionist or dietitians who would be able to leverage that information and that approach in dealing with a patient. Basically, the paradigm is one that says, you're going to get your 15 minutes with the doctor and you're going to walk out of here with a prescription, and that's what modern medicine is all about. It's really not typical that you're going to then be transferred to a dietitian who's going to spend an hour and a half with you and walk you through what intermittent fasting is all about, how to identify hidden sources of gluten at the grocery store, etc. But these are the types of interventions that people are really desperate for, because there's no downside, and they oftentimes can bring about significant improvements in patients who've been struggling.
And so one of the things that you mentioned, obviously, that people had this precondition that if you had celiac disease, then you would be sensitive to gluten, and then gluten would be a problem. Clearly, that's something you try to dispel with Grain Brain, in the fact that you don't have to have this overt condition to react negatively to gluten. And I think that a ketogenic diet can be very helpful for a lot of things that it adds, but I also think that a lot of the benefit comes from things that you, by definition, have to remove, namely sugars and certain grains and wheat and gluten especially. And so how are we looking at, let's say somebody tries to get a ketogenic diet, they don't want to stay as strict, so they start incorporating other foods back. What is your, sales pitch to people of, sure, add some other foods back in if you want, but stay away from the gluten-containing foods more specifically, and for what reasons?
Well, I would say that the biggest culprit is not going to be gluten, it's going to be sugar. And so gluten is really important. It's on the list. But I think, the real issue in the modern American Western diet is the amount of sugar and refined carbohydrates that raise blood sugar and ultimately lead to insulin resistance. And in my world, that has a huge impact on brain function. So I think that people really need to gain some deep understanding about sugar, and where you find it and what the types of sugar are that are out there. People seem to think, well, I'm on a sugar-free diet, a low-sugar diet, and you start your day with a 12-ounce glass of orange juice and a bowl of yogurt. And, the reality is you're bombarding your body right off the bat with foods that you think are good, but are loaded with sugar. There's 9 grams of sugar in a 12-ounce glass of orange juice, 36 grams, which is 9 teaspoons of sugar. 9 teaspoons of white sugar in a glass of OJ. Now, you couple that with your croissant or your whole grain bread, and your blood sugars are going to skyrocket right off the bat. Your insulin's going to skyrocket. Your blood sugars will then plummet, and you'll be craving carbs by noontime. That said, how do people respond to those events of their metabolism? That's basically, again, another carbohydrate load, and they're just locked in. People have this just crazy idea that natural sugar is a better choice, whether it's natural cane sugar, natural coconut sugar, or agave nectar. I mean, what a beautiful word, agave nectar, the fruit of the gods. Well, the reality is these are all sugar. And agave might well be one of the most dangerous sugars that has ever been mistakenly promoted. I mean, people say, well, it's not going to raise your glucose level and you're not going to have an insulin response very much. That's true. The reason being is because it's so darn high in fructose, even higher than high fructose corn syrup. So you're dramatically increasing your risk for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, as well as body-wide inflammation and raising of your triglycerides, everything you don't want to do. Oh, well, what about honey, natural organic honey, or maple syrup that comes from these beautiful trees, up in the Northeast? It doesn't matter. It's sugar. So I think people have to they need to spend the time with the dietitian and learn about what sugar really is, where it's hiding in the ketchup, in the drinks that you're consuming. And beyond that, a nice education in terms of the profound dangers of artificial sweeteners. A lot of people think, I'm going to do the best I can. I'm not going to drink sugar anymore. I'm going to drink Diet Coke. Well, it's about the worst thing you could do. Your risk of obesity and diabetes go up dramatically when you're consuming no sugar, artificially sweetened beverages. And, that sounds ironic, but the reality of the situation is that's what very, very large studies have demonstrated. One study in France, over 70,000 individuals, and demonstrating a profound increased risk of type 2 diabetes in excess of what you would have if you were drinking sugar-sweetened beverages each day. What is the mechanism? Well, the mechanism is quite clear now, demonstrated in both humans and in laboratory animals, is changes in the gut bacteria. So basically, you're changing the bacteria in the gut to the extent that they believe that your body is in a state of starvation, and you hold on to every calorie, and your insulin resistance goes up, blood sugar obviously goes up, and people gain weight in a dose-dependent fashion, directly related to the number of diet drinks you have in a day. So it's all about education. And, the word doctor means teacher. And that's our mission here. That, when you look at, for example, a study published in the journal The Lancet, it was a study in 5 continents, 18 countries. And it showed that those individuals whose diets derived the most calories from carbohydrates had an increased risk of death of 28%, whereas those whose highest source of calories was from the dreaded fat had a 23% risk reduction in comparison. So oddly enough, highest levels of the dreaded saturated fat was associated with a decreased death rate during the course of the study by 20%. So I really think we have to take a step back and understand that, we've been told a bunch of stuff over the past few decades. And the reality is we now recognize that it wasn't necessarily because that's what the science told us, but rather because industry had influenced what science was putting out, and it was not necessarily in our interest.
So obviously the ketogenic diet is one of these things that, like you said, is now a very popular thing, and people are now focusing on this. Is there anything else that you see now that you're like, oh man, in 10 years, this is going to be one of those things where we all think is very obvious, but right now nobody is taking seriously?
Oh, without a doubt. I mean, there are various things that would play off the so-called ketogenic diet. That ultimately work in similar ways. The fasting mimicking diet, for example, being on a calorie restriction, intermittent fasting, raising blood ketones without necessarily carb restriction. We can do with using precursors like MCT oil, etc. But I think that we are just at the very beginning of seeing literature that is recognizing that exosomes, or small vesicles that come out of plant cells and contain RNA, are able to change the various populations of gut bacteria, the metabolic activity of gut bacteria, and even the location of gut bacteria. This is beyond huge. So we're just beginning, as of this literature came out several months ago, to understand how these microRNAs that are contained in these plant exosomes are so influential in terms of what our gut bacteria are doing. The relocalization of gut bacteria to the lining of the gut to help reduce the leakiness based upon consumption of certain foods is now thought to be mediated by actual RNA contained in the plant cells themselves. Now that we understand that, we're going to see, I hate to use the word manipulation, but the creation of various medical foods that contain specific plant RNAs that are then able to influence the gut bacteria to allow these gut bacteria to make some of the good things that they do. Higher levels of B vitamins, short-chain fatty acids, neurotransmitters, and allow these bacteria, for example, to relocate back to the gut lining to reduce gut permeability, which we now know is fundamentally involved in increasing inflammation. Why is that important? It's important because inflammation is, in fact, the cornerstone of chronic degenerative diseases, which the World Health Organization tells us are the number one cause of death on the planet. So, yeah, I'm real excited about that. I mean, I get pumped up about the ketogenic diet as well. I mean, because we enter the popular conversation when we talk about that, but the future holds some really exciting things happening in the near term as well that I'm getting really pumped up about.
Yeah, I think that with any of this technology that we have to now do more in the microbiome, though, we have some risk to kind of distill things into really weird areas. So I'm just thinking of this future where, like you said, there's some plant RNA that can translocate bacteria or this and that, where we want to now make certain foods or supplements, or why don't we just eat those foods? And I think that's one of those things, like the more we learn, the more complex we try to make it, and really the more simple it should be. What's your take on that?
I think that, there's always been this tendency in science to isolate the active ingredient from this or that, natural source. And I think we've learned time and time again that we're much better off consuming these components in their natural state, coupled with other things that they're with which they are found in nature. So I think we still have to get away from that mentality of the so-called active ingredient, or the most powerful component of a certain plant or other food source. So that said, however, I still think there is a place to leverage this science in terms of creating food products. So I think we're definitely going to see that. And I think the other area that is really very, very exciting is now that we have the ability to work with big data, we are beginning to understand trends as they relate to seemingly disparate ideas. For example, relationships between diabetes and the development of Parkinson's disease. I mean, who ever would have put that together? The relationship of inflammatory bowel disease, for example, with diabetes, whereby having that diagnosis, inflammatory bowel disease, confers about a 28% increased risk of a brain inflammatory problem called Parkinson's. And importantly, the treatment of the inflammatory bowel disease with so-called biologics is associated with a 78% reduced risk of Parkinson's. So we're starting to see big data be leveraged and digested in such a way that it's revealing some really unexpected but meaningful relationships. That said, it's going to allow us then to leverage treatments that are currently being used for one disease for another disease. I mean, for example, in the case of inflammatory bowel disease and Parkinson's, it might mean, therefore, that treating Parkinson's patients with etanercept or other medications that are involved in reducing or binding these inflammatory mediators might be effective. There is certainly a protocol for using this etanercept in the treatment of Alzheimer's, for example. And I think that the other area that really is very, very exciting is the area of personalized medicine, whereby we're now in a place of being able to gather so many biometrics on an individual in terms of his or her baseline genetics, metabolic profile, microbial profile, etc., and really being able to start to think about cultivating unique programs for that individual based upon his or her uniqueness, as opposed to the sort of one-size-fits-all mentality that is so pervasive in Western medicine, whereby ultimately as 3% of the population serves as the experimental group for then generalization to the remaining 97% in terms of what they should do and take to treat their various diseases. So, the reality is that we test medications on less than 3% of people, and yet these are the medicines used on the whole group, the whole remaining, the 100%. Whatever the treatment may be, hypertension or you name it, it's very, very important that we recognize that people have different ways, for example, of metabolizing various medications. And that science is available to us now. We can identify who may or may not respond to a particular medication based upon looking at their genome. And when you can sequence a human genome for $99 and you can do it online, for crying out loud, that information is important and it's available, and we're starting to see even drugstore pharmacies now making that information available in terms of selecting who may or may not respond to a medication and who may or may not have an untoward reaction to a particular medication.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of things that you tapped into that I think are exciting moving forward. I'm just curious, what are the things that maybe even since 5 years ago have you maybe changed your mind on? Like I said, the protein in the ketogenic diet, I've certainly updated my thinking on that, and I was certainly wrong. Anything since Grain Brain first came out that you are updating or that you kind of missed the mark on?
To be humble, I would really like to say so. I keep looking for something that we were wrong on, but and I'm happy to admit I'm wrong. The point is, though, our contentions were that sugar is bad, that a high carbohydrate diet is not a good thing for you, and that gluten may represent a source of inflammation in people who don't have celiac disease but may have gluten sensitivity. Beyond that, we said you've got to exercise. That's very important. Certain vitamins are important. You try to lower your homocysteine, et cetera. So we really, we said we put forth some very fundamental tenets, and I can't think that any of them has been refuted. Right. Now, I would say that 15, 20 years ago, I was very much dialed into a very low-fat diet, for example, in the treatment of multiple sclerosis. And I've revised my position on that, indicating that what I published in those days absolutely was turned around. And I'm delighted to admit that. I think that really this new book that's coming out in next month, the revision, the 5-year revision of Grain Brain, what that does is summarize what has gone on since Grain Brain was published, and what we've seen is just a dramatic amplification of really everything we've talked about, of the relationship, for example, of an elevated A1C in non-diabetics, I might add, to cognitive decline. That study was published this year, 2018, in Diabetologia. The relationship of inflammation. There was a study done in the journal Neurology that looked at 1,600 individuals measuring blood markers of inflammation, followed these people for 24 years. You talk about a long study. And then determined that those individuals with higher levels of blood markers of inflammation had a dramatically increased risk for shrinkage of their brains, one of the things that we see in dementia, as well as a decline in their episodic memory. So, that certainly talks about what is it in people that raises inflammation. Well, we know that inflammation strongly correlates with higher body mass index and especially higher levels of abdominal fat. That said, we know that individuals who 30 years ago had a larger abdomen, that's all that they measured, 30 years later, and the study was published last year, have demonstrated a significant correlation to increased risk of dementia. So it tells us that we've got to, jump on these 30 and 40-year-old people and tell them that, the lifestyle choices that you are making today are either going to pave the way for health or disability 20, 30 years down the line. And, what I would say to any of your listeners in that age bracket is those years go by very quickly, and you're going to be very happy that you got yourself in shape and kept your blood sugar low right now in your 30s and 40s, because sooner or later you're going to, the time's going to go by and you're going to be fully functional and enjoying life while some of your friends may not be.
And so one of the things that you touched on as well, I mean, there's a lot of different factors here. One of the things that I'm fascinated with as well, I mean, we dig into nutrition a lot in figuring this out. It's obviously a huge lever to pull. But another one I think that is underestimated is exercise, but not only types of exercise. So one of the things that I've been doing lately, I've had a Dexcom G6 implanted in my belly for the last month or so, testing a lot of different things. And one of the things that I found out is that if I just generally exercise and do some movement stuff or even run or do biking, blood sugar and like the baseline doesn't really change that much. However, if I do heavy weight training and the resistance training and add on some weight, dramatic shift. So a huge baseline shift to a reduction of 10 to 20 points that holds for the rest of the day. Are you seeing this type of stuff at all from a neurological impact of types of exercise, or is it just any raising of the heart rate, or is resistance training having any sort of edge here?
It's a very good question. And to some degree, I think the right answer there is getting us back to our discussion of personalized medicine. So people do respond differently. And I think overall, I mean, my mission is to get people to have their heart rates elevated for at least 20 minutes a day. And, the target heart rate that we use, of course, varies with the individual based upon his or her level of fitness. We usually use a ballpark of 180 minus a person's age. But I do believe that resistance exercise has a very important role to play, not just moment to moment in terms of blood glucose and insulin levels, but more in terms of long term, in terms of insulin sensitivity. So there's a very big play there between resistance exercise and improving insulin sensitivity. In my world, the world of neurology, I noted with great interest the report appearing in our journal Neurology in December of 2017. Now, this was in a section of this highly regarded peer-reviewed journal that was talking about practice guidelines. In other words, what should you as a neurologist do in a particular situation? Now, here's the situation. You're confronted with a patient or that patient's family, and that patient has what we call mild cognitive impairment. It means you can now test this patient and demonstrate that he or she is having some difficulties with cognition. We generally talk about MCI, mild cognitive impairment, as a prelude or harbinger for Alzheimer's disease. So people come into the office, their score on our various tests shows some decline, and we know that likely they're on their way to full-blown Alzheimer's disease. The question that is posed is, what can we do, doctor? What can we do for dad at this point? And what a question it is. And the journal article that gave us specific recommendations looked at 15 different interventions. Every drug that was possibly out there and possibly useful was looked at, and they recommended only one drug that could significantly slow the progression from MCI to full-blown Alzheimer's, and it was a drug called exercise. Can you imagine? And I say that, can you imagine, for a couple of reasons. First of all, who knew? Well, those of us involved in more of a functional medicine approach have known this for a long time. But beyond that, what is so compelling for me is that a wonderfully well-respected peer-reviewed neurology journal sponsored by drug companies came to the conclusion and published the fact that the only thing that worked was physical exercise. I thought that was breathtaking. I thought it was so cool that they were very transparent and they weren't political about it. They said, look, we applied the same level of scrutiny to each of these parameters, and the only thing that worked was exercise, meaning that what a mainstream neurologist should be telling his or her patient right now who comes in with some cognitive issues is, you need to get to the gym tomorrow. You need to buy something right now that's going to help you, and that is a new pair of running shoes. Whatever it is, it's not a pill, it's not a prescription. You got to get to the gym. Now, truthfully, that's not an area of comfort for practicing physicians, A, and B, it's not the type of information that patients are used to receiving or even acting upon. But when our most well-respected neurology journal tells us that is what we should be doing, we got to really take notice of that information.
Right. And so obviously exercise is a huge part, nutrition is a huge part. What are the other parameters, I guess, in as far as looking at health, from a neurological standpoint, or just for somebody who wants to optimize their health, that they should be pulling for levers?
Well, I think perhaps one area that doesn't really get as much attention, and that is sleep. We know as it relates to risk for cognitive decline and even full-blown Alzheimer's, that sleep is very, very important. We know that getting not enough sleep is a powerful risk factor for dementia, and oddly enough, we note that new research indicates that individuals who have prolonged sleep, who sleep greater than 9 hours a day, are also at over a 10-year period of time are at increased risk of dementia as well. And in fact, that is something that I think is relatively new. So it really gives us this sense of the sweet spot, or the U-shaped curve, where too little of something, or Goldilocks, right? The porridge is too hot, the porridge is too cold, but this one's just right. And we see that really quite extensively in medicine now, that, we think that if something is good, more is better. Like if getting your blood sugar low is good, then getting it lower is better. Getting your ketones high, insulin level low. And in reality, not necessarily true, even as it relates to insulin. And I've been a big proponent of insulin being lower for years, and maybe getting back to grain brain and what did we get wrong. I think perhaps we left people back then with the notion that the lower the insulin, the better, but turns out that research doesn't confirm that. Research confirms that really low levels of insulin in a Swedish study that spanned 30 years, very, very low levels of insulin translate to increased risk of dementia. So we've got to be a little bit careful. So I think that not valuing the importance of sleep, I think, is to our disservice. We should be spending more time in doing sleep studies, in looking at individuals in terms of their, not just the time that they think they're sleeping, but rather the quality of their sleep. Are they dropping into deeper stages of sleep that are therefore restorative? We know that in obese individuals, when you can work on their quality of sleep, that their brain function will actually improve. So we've seen research that indicates that if these individuals are sleeping less than 6.5 hours a night, in obese individuals, this translates to some significant issues with reference to memory, attention, and even motor skills, which can then improve when steps are taken to actually improve sleep. And these are generally non-pharmaceutical types of intervention. Many people, obese people especially, who have interrupted sleep and therefore not able to experience restorative sleep, have sleep apnea. And there are various techniques, first to identify it, and then secondarily to remedy that situation that can be very, very effective and allow these individuals to improve their memory and their attention skills and their even their executive function. So I think I'm a huge proponent of adults getting sleep studies. I had one myself. And I think it's very, very important that we know how well we are clearing debris in our brains, which is one of the main things through the so-called glymphatic system that sleep does. It allows the brain to take out the garbage, if you will. And that's very important.
So is this the only way that, let's say, an average person wanted to know, okay, how much deep restorative sleep am I getting? Is it a sleep study? Is it just subjective feeling? What are some of the ways that people can actually quantify some of this stuff?
I think you need a sleep study. We're now seeing at-home various devices that are able to upload to your iPhone or your smartphone, then to a site, and to some degree determine the quality of your sleep. I personally went for the whole Monty and had the EEG monitoring as well as the monitoring of my heart my breathing, and even pulse oximeter to determine if I was oxygenating well. So I think the more information you can gain about yourself, the better position you're in to make appropriate changes. So I think a sleep study is something in our society that should be part of a general preventive medicine evaluation. And I say that in our society for one reason, because of the pervasiveness of overweight and obesity now affecting 2/3 of adults in America. Therefore, they're at risk for sleep disorders, i.e., compromising their brain function and increased risk for Alzheimer's. Therefore, let's get the sleep study.
Interesting. Anything other than sleep, exercise, nutrition, any other large factors that you can think of that?
Yeah, I think stress is huge. I think that when we recognize the incredible biochemical events that occur during with prolonged stress or even isolated stress that is more severe, this turns out to be a major event in terms of the changes in the body that can pave the way for changes in the gut bacteria, therefore inflammation, and therefore increased brain permeability, blood-brain barrier permeability, and devastating effects. So we don't, people don't talk about it. They say, oh yeah, I'm trying to limit my stress. I have a stressful job, on and on. Hey, these things add up quite a bit. Beyond that, I think that there are also some very important top of the list types of things that people can learn from having their genome sequenced. And, it might sound really technical, but I would say that getting a 23andMe, for example, and I don't work for them, but that happens to be the one that I did. Getting your 23andMe information, I think, is very important if you're able to take that information, upload it to one of the many sites online that can interpret the data for you and let you know what it means. And there's great information to be had there that, again, gets back to this notion of personalized medicine. What did I learn about myself? I learned about myself that my specific genome indicates that I am a poor methylator. Now, that sounds really technical, but what it means is basically I don't have a great ability to use the standard types of B vitamins that I might get if I take a multivitamin or take a B vitamin. That the types of B vitamins I need to take have to be methylated, the folate, methylated folate, B12, etc. That said, now that I know that, I can make that simple change, and that's really good for me because it allows me to reduce my risk then of cardiovascular disease and even Alzheimer's. There are other things that you can learn from looking at your genome and having your genome evaluated, again, at one of these online sites to determine what you might need in terms of specific nutrients, how you might be compromised by exposure to certain types of medications or caffeine or other things that you may be involved in. So I think that those are really important things to understand. I was very taken when I looked at my own information about how grateful I was to learn this information.
So obviously a lot of technical stuff we're getting into so far. There's a lot of things maybe people are overwhelmed hearing all of these topics from listening to this podcast. But what are maybe some of the biggest things? It seems like maybe eat real food, move, sleep, like worry about, reducing your stress. What would it be kind of for you as a short?
You got it. I mean, if there are bullet points for your listeners that are fundamental towards the goal of remaining healthy, and even as it relates to reducing your risk for things like Alzheimer's, they would include avoiding sugar in all of its forms, avoiding artificial sweeteners, reducing simple carbohydrates as well, increasing your consumption of dietary fat. Who knew how healthful olive oil is, nuts, seeds, the fat that you get in grass-fed beef, wild fish, nuts and seeds, I mentioned, organic they should be, and being learned and recognizing that the common processed vegetable oils, another form of fat that people tend to consume, are not good for you. So looking at the types of fat you consume, limiting your sugars and avoiding artificial sweeteners, and then equally important are the other two things we mentioned. Getting exercise every single day. It's not just because you heard some doctor on the podcast today say, well, yeah, exercise is good for you. The results in terms of reducing your risk for Alzheimer's are profound. That and also sleep. This is great science, and we don't have a treatment, none whatsoever. As you and I have this conversation right now, there is no pharmaceutical intervention that has any meaningful effect on the course of Alzheimer's disease. None. So we know that lowering your blood sugar, getting some exercise, and improving the quality of your sleep are associated with a dramatic reduction in risk for that disease for which there is no treatment. I think I'm being as clear as I possibly can here. John Kennedy said that the time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. And I think that this is such an important message that I would like to leave with your listeners, and that is perhaps nowhere else is preventive medicine as important and validated as it turns out to be as it relates to the brain. And we didn't know that. We were the last, we as neurologists were the last to the preventive medicine party. And yet it turns out that the brain is really responsive to these lifestyle choices.
Thank you so much, Dr. David Perlmutter. All right, everyone. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Keto Answers podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, but even if you didn't, I would love a review. Just go over to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and pop in a review so we can get found by more people, get better guests, and have the information that you need. So please go to iTunes, wherever you listen to your podcasts, and leave us a review. And if you're new to keto, head on over to perfectketo.com/podcast and enter your email for all our top tips and guides on getting started with the ketogenic diet. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.